Few things are as annoying as starting to work with yarn and realizing that it is basically impossible to use. The texture's driving you nuts, it's fraying, it's splitting, it's piling. So I have got together my yarn red flags so that we all know what to look out for when we're picking new brands. Vague packaging. Avoid yarns where it is unclear what the fibre content is or the exact proportions of the fibre content. For example, I've seen yarns that say acrylic blend, but give you no idea what the acrylic's blended with. It's not very helpful and it doesn't give you a lot of clues about how that fibre is going to work up if you don't actually know what the fibre is. A lack of washing instructions. So many yarns don't include basic washing instructions on the packaging. If you're making something that there is any likelihood that it's going to need to go in the wash at some point in the future, you need those washing instructions because they vary wildly between different types of yarn. No hook size. This one is a little bit debatable. So for example, I will use a yarn that has no hook size if I know exactly what the fibre content is and what the yarn weight is based on a lot of experience working with yarns. But if you're relatively new to the hobby or less confident in working it out yourself, if it's not got a hook size, just don't use it. Texture. If I see it in the shop, what I'll do is I'll pick it up. First, I'll just sort of rub it in my hands a bit gently. If nobody's watching and I don't have foundation on, I'll give it a bit of a rub on my face as well, because that gives you a really clear idea of whether you're going to like working with the texture. If there's a loose strand, rub it between your fingers as well, because that is where the friction's going to be and where you're going to get the most feel for it when you're crocheting. Have a look at the individual strands. Give them a little gentle tug. Don't be rough with it, you've not paid for it yet, but give it a little bit of a tug. Just make sure there's no obvious splitting, fraying. Piling. Some yarns will pile just when you rub them between your fingers like this. You'll come away and be like, whoa, that's no good. If a yarn piles easily, I don't want to work for it. A lot of yarns will pile a bit after time regardless, and I want one that's going to keep that piling process as far into the future as possible. If you're getting it from a shop, make sure it's clean. This is something that I have actually fallen foul of before when just grabbing a few from the same dye lot and popping them in my basket. One of the skeins of yarn that I brought home, it was dirty. There were actual stains, like dirt stains in the yarn. Dirty stains, just visually, it's very unlikely to be dirty and stained on the inside. Just eyeball the outside, make sure it's clean. And in the same vein, is it dusty? If a yarn's been on the shelf for a long time, it might have picked up dust. And while that's not the end of the world, and some yarns you can just give them a quick hoover, other ones, if you try to hoover or dust the surface of the yarn to make them clean before you work with it, it then causes all the piling and fraying and splitting issues that we want to avoid. So if it's dusty, don't use it. Other types of yarn seem to be fluff magnets, and it's not quite the same as being dusty from being on the shelf. You'll know it if you've seen it. So particular yarns you'll pick up and they'll have been next to a slightly different fibre. For example, I might pick up a cotton blend that's been next to a plush yarn, and it seems to have magnetised little fibres of the plush yarn all over the surface of that yarn as well. That tells me that when I start crocheting with it, sitting on my sofa, surrounded by a cat, small humans, and other life paraphernalia, that yarn is not going to stay in a nice state for very long. And on the same vein, but slightly weirder, smell. If it's appropriate to do so when you don't have a cold, give it a bit of a sniff. Some yarns have this awful chemical smell. Now, whether that's something to do with the actual fibre that's used or to do with the cleaning process, if it's a wool, some yarns have a smell that it's not tolerable. If you're a person who doesn't like smells that are bad, give your yarn a sniff before you buy it. Smell is also a red flag for mould. Sometimes unscrupulous yarn dealers, that's a thing, will let the yarn that they have in stock go a little bit damp, and that then makes it mouldy, and we can generally smell when that's happened. So give it a sniff, no chemical smells, no mould, happy yarn. And that's funny because this is Happy Place yarn that I'm using too. example. I don't have any of these problems with this yarn. Dye lots can also be a red flag, and this is something that has only happened to me a couple of times before. I'd be really interested to know if it's happened to you. I've obviously fallen foul as a new crocheter and one very sad day wallpaperer when I had to re-wallpaper half of a wall. I didn't check dye lots. Dye lots tells you whether the colours are going to match. If something is in the same dye lot, then it should have a seamless transition when you go on to a new skein. However, I have got two skeins of yarn which have the same dye lot number and they are visibly different. So check your dye lots, but don't trust your dye lots without holding the skeins next to each other too. They are not infallible. Now, whether that's to do with where in the vat of dye they ended up or just a mistake in printing, I don't know, but it is worth checking the visual colours as well as the numbers on the dye lot. Poorly wound skeins. You know when you pick up a skein of yarn and it's all together in a nice big chunky mass like this? That's what you want. If you pick it up and it's kind of falling into pieces in your hands while it's still in its packaging, that tends to mean that once you start working with it, it's going to be a lot more prone to tangles. It's a red flag. If it's not nice and tightly wound, I would tend to say walk away. Now, do be aware, sometimes you will get yarn that is in a loose skein that you need to wind in order to work with. That's fine, that's not the same issue, but if it's meant to look like this traditional ball or cake of yarn and it's flopping about the place, don't go there. And obviously tangled skeins are no good either, and this happens all the time if you go to the big yarn stores which have lots of yarn on shelves. Some of those will be tangled already on the shelf. Now, whether that's through being poorly packaged or people having picked them up, looked at them and fiddled around with them a bit too much, then they can be tangled, and just avoid. If it's tangled, it's not worth the effort. Sorry, I understand how yarn is made. At some point they will have to join two strands together. However, very few things infuriate me more than working on a project, concentrating intently, knowing that I don't have to colour change for ages, and then suddenly I effectively have to do the action of colour changing because they've just wedged a big hard knot between the two strands. At least join it in a way that I don't have to cut a bit out of it or spend ages unpicking. Brands of yarn where you can see that they've knotted the strands together, to me, I don't want to deal with it. Red flag. Not everyone's going to agree with me on this one, but bargain bins are a red flag. Firstly, don't assume that you're getting a really good deal just because it's in a bargain bin. So often the bargain bin has a tiny amount of money knocked off for something that you weren't actually going to buy anyway. Remember, it's only a bargain in the bargain bin if it is exactly a yarn that you were going to use anyway. Otherwise, it's just more room taken up in your yarn stash with another thing that's going to sit there looking pretty but never actually being useful, and probably not saving you any money, costing you money instead. There are more red flags that do come up once you've already bought it. Separating strands is such a common one for this. They can look quite tight, and then once you start, the strands come apart, and that is annoying because what it does is interrupt your flow, because you have to be more careful to pick up the whole strand and not just half the strand. And you also get that annoying thing sometimes where you've picked up half a strand, you've done a few more stitches and you're like, oh, this is not right. And it started separating. It's probably not the yarn for this project. Likewise with fraying. Again, it's a complete time thief when yarn frays. It interrupts your work, and it can happen a little bit later on, and then it makes what you've just made just not look quite as pretty. Something that I have had very recently with the yarn I was working with is inconsistent thickness of strands. Now, this wasn't because they'd separated or a bit had frayed or split off. It was literally as you went along the strand, thicker and finer in different places. Now, it was a fairly heavy wool content, so it is understandable in a way that there would be some more variation than you would get in a synthetic. However, this was wild. It was basically made the difference between like a fine yarn in some places and like an Aran or worsted weight yarn in other places, which gives so inconsistent looking stitches. So if you lift your strand and look at it, or you start working with it and it is is showing inconsistencies, again, it's a real red flag because it's going to impact how your project looks. I want to talk about knotting and getting stuck because predominantly I don't use plush yarn. I have strong feelings about plush yarn. Someone's challenged me on this and they're sending me a brand of plush yarn that's new, so that'll be exciting for the future. But for now, not a plush yarn person. And the main reason for that is because of the fine strand through the middle. I find when you're doing stuff like making magic circles, it ties in a knot because you're essentially crocheting with a thread that's got some fluff around it. And to me, it's a huge red flag. I don't want to be working with a yarn that is going to tie itself in knots that I didn't make. Do better, plush yarn, or me, or use different methods. There are a lot of thoughts. I'll link them. And finally, and possibly the most infuriating thing that happens to me whilst crocheting, it's squeaking. You can't really test for it in the shop. But once you've started working with a yarn and it is audible, I don't want to play anymore. That is not the yarn for me. Now, sometimes you can get around it by swapping to a different crochet hook that's made from a different material but is the same size. But if the yarn squeaks, so a lot of these you can check for before you bring the yarn home, and that is great. It's harder when we're buying online. I do prefer to buy and try new yarns in person. But if you pick your yarn and you bring it home and any of these red flags crop up and you're still near the beginning of the project, my advice is walk away from that yarn. Donate it to charity, use it as stuffing. But if the yarn is annoying you whilst you're working with it, it's going to slow your project down, it's going to make it not look as good at the finish, and you're just going to be furious when crochet is meant to make you happy. So what red flags have I missed? Which ones did you agree with? Which ones did you disagree with? Let's chat in the comments section below, and I can't wait to see you there.